Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome back to Rules of Engagement Talking Tactics for the third segment out of 4 for this show. And before we jump into this third segment, one quick reminder, please tweet at me your questions at ISAxLav. There's a little bit of delay on Twitter, so if you wanted to be answered on today's episode, you pretty much gotta tweet them right about now. And of course, I mean, you can tweet them later and answer them tomorrow's episode, right? Tweet whenever. But if you want them to be answered at the end of today's episode, send them over right about now, or any ones you sent earlier. We're going to check those out in a little bit. But for now, let's get into our third segment. It's going to be featuring a Protoss versus Zerg, and we're going to be talking about how to deal with crisis management. And so there's a couple of things you want to deal with in that. One is you have to be very careful of your positioning. So when you're under fire, the first thing to think about is, where should I position my units? Don't worry about how to micro them, just where to place them. Number 2 is macro. You got to keep up your macro. A lot of times when you're under pressure, all of a sudden your whole build gets disrupted. So get that back on focus. Make sure there's no macro errors going on. Then once that's kind of done, that's like the primary part of the crisis control. The next thing is you want to understand where you're at in the game, so you can then make an informed decision on how to basically react once you've kind of cleared up this crisis. So let's get right into the game here. We're going to look at a Protoss versus Zerg on Ohana. And in this situation, we're looking at a Protoss who's trying to take a third base, and he's doing a very, there's a very standard build. You get 4 warp gates, right? He's got 1 in his wall, 3 back here. Those are turning into warp gates at the moment. He's got a robotics facility. He's got a Twilight Council. He's doing something that's a little bit unique, which is he's going to actually double forge early, which is something I haven't really seen too often, and it's actually a really neat idea. Maybe we'll talk about it in another show at some point, the idea of going double forge early versus Zerg. But the basic idea, it's, it's not a super fast third base, it's not a slow third base. It's just like a very, very kind of very safe, relatively standard, basic Protoss versus Zerg build. So right here, we're already looking at he knew there was these speedings crossing the map because he got this observer, right? That's super important. You have your observers, you know if they're making units. Then he's talking about the positioning of his guys, right? So see how he puts the Nexus, the Pylon, and then his units are all here in this little tiny corner here. That's very, very important for positioning. You got to hide the units behind this Pylon, right? The other thing to notice is that right now he's got a probe. This is a probe that's meant to build additional extra gateways, cannons, etc. to reinforce this position. His probe dies, right? So now this is crisis management. How does he deal with all of a sudden, we're going to fast forward a bit, another little attack here, but his units are positioning well. He's totally fine. How does he deal with the fact that all of a sudden his whole plan's been disrupted? He can't get those extra gateways, get the wall going. He thinks it's his macro, right? His units are positioned fine. I mean, now they're spreading out because the Zerg's mostly dead. But he dealt with it. They make sure the units are positioning well. Then he's dealing with the macro by adding the gateways back at home. Not quite as fast as he wanted them to. That's why his money got a little bit high. But he had to prioritize the unit positioning before he did the macro. But then as soon as that's cleared up, got to get right back on track with the macro. You can't make the wall because your probe's not there. Go ahead and build those buildings somewhere else. Okay, then he's going to deal with this harass for a little bit. And the Zerg is going to continue to throw stuff at him, right? Zerg is just continuing to throw stuff. His units are positioned very well, so they're fairly safe. The Zerg thinks he has him trapped, but a greatly positioned Pylon. Very important to always be able to warp in to help your army. He's able to hold this off yet again. We're going to just fast forward a bit to when he holds off this initial wave. Sorry, going through this replay a little bit quick here. The Zerg's trying to find holes. A few Zerglings get in, but he doesn't panic about that. He just runs the probes, right? Meanwhile, his army's going to defend this section. He's going to run the probes, and he's going to let the warp in deal with that, right? A few units, 5 Zelt warping, 6 Zelt warping, that can deal with that fine while he keeps his main army back to defend, the next wave of Zerg, we could say. So Zerg does another little run by again. Some good force fields here. But the point I wanted to get to is the next part is understanding the position, right? So right this moment right now, he's pretty much cleared up everything but this few little roaches here. And now, using these observers, he's noticed there's no 4th base, right? And he's noticed that there's a constant rally of roaches and Zerglings coming at him. So he should know his position is that his army is getting stronger and stronger because the Zerg can no longer engage this army with just roaches and Zerglings. So his army keeps getting bigger. The Zerg army doesn't. As time goes on, he'll be in a better and better position. So that's where he just needs to play a little more defensively. I think what's happened, though, is he's panicking. He's feeling he's being pressured, so he has to attack. And he moves out here, right? And then, of course, Zerg can do more run-bys. But right here, if he didn't run by, if he just stayed on the very defensive spot, he's got equal economy, right? And if you look at the army value, his army value is actually ahead of his opponent, and it scales better because it's Sentries and Immortals and other Protoss units versus just Roaches and Speeding. So basically, this is the point. This is the one mistake he made. He did everything great at handling this harass, except then he moved out to attack in a situation where he really, if he took a moment to breathe when you're dealing with a crisis, and you say, okay, I've dealt with a crisis. Where's my opponent at? How much did he sacrifice to launch that attack, and how much did I use to defend it? I should just hold off a little bit longer and stabilize first. And I mean, he does end up winning this game anyway. He's at a very good position right now, but he could have made it. Instead of taking 10 more minutes to close it out, maybe it would have been 5 if he just stayed a little bit more defensive for a little bit longer. Let's actually just do a quick recap on those 3 points about crisis management once more real quick. So the first thing you want to look at is you want to look at make sure your unit positioning is solid so you don't lose your army, because if you lose your army, you lose the game. All right, that's always number 1. Number 2 is then make sure your macro is running smoothly, because it was most likely disrupted if you're in a crisis management position. And then number 3 is once you have a breather for a second, try to figure out if you should be defending or attacking. Basically, try to figure out what position you are at in the game. And if you keep in mind those 3 things, get a little checklist in your head. Every time, let's say, a drop comes in, it ruins your base. There's a lot of problems like that. Get those 3 things in your head, kind of run through them, and you should enhance your handling of crisis management situations. So we're going to take a quick break, then we're going to get back in the Q&A segment of today's show.